Okay, let's just pray. So thank you for this crazy but amazing and justice-centered guy. Thank you so much for all he is, all you put in him. Father, please help us to hear you through him today. Thank you. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Pete, and well, thank you, everybody. It's lovely to be back with you. A few I've met before, and we were last, I think, with my much younger family there. Then with you about 15 years ago. I saw Pete and Kath and various nieces and nephews only in September when we were up there for our dad's 90th birthday. In case everything Pete's just said sounds all a bit miserable, there have been huge joys also working with Christians right around the world on these justice issues, and a lot of laughs. I mean, I'll tell you one, giving away one of my security routines. When I was in Chile, you know, as Pete said, I sort of went in on a tourist passport under the Pinochet regime. And I said to my wife, we'd only been married a few months, and I said, look, if I phone you, because there was no emails or anything then, if I phone you and if I talk about the food, I'm actually talking about security. So if I say the food is fine, you don't need to worry. If I'm saying I've got an upset stomach, I'm not really talking about my stomach. I'm talking about the security is not good. I need to get out of here. The food's a bit rubbish. You know? So after about 2 weeks, I was aware that I was being asked more questions than I was happy with at the reception in this hotel in the second city where I'd actually gone to try and photograph the British ships that we knew were being sold to Chile. And I got a really good shot of one of our destroyers sailing into the port. Anyway, we went back to the hotel being asked too many questions. So I phoned Sarah and I said, look, and she said, how's the food? I said, well, not so good. I might see if I can find a different restaurant to eat in, which meant I'm going to move hotel. She said, oh, well, yeah, I hope you're feeling better. You know, about 2 days later, she said to her mum, well, mum said, how's Andy? Have you heard from him? She said, yeah, he said he's all right, but the food's not so good. She said, that's the code. That's the code. And she'd completely forgotten. So, you know, we got back, I'm alive, but it's also had a lot of laughs and a lot of comic turns doing this kind of job. It's not all misery. Anyway, thank you for having me. On with the story. Let's start with a little bit of citizen science, if I may. I'd like you all, I'm going to ask you just some short questions. I'd love you to raise your hand or press your waving button if you can, and keep it up until I've asked all 4 questions. If the answer to any of these questions for you is yes, please just put your hand up like this or wave and then keep it up. Let's see what happens. As I said, this could be chaos. Haven't done it on Zoom before, but we'll give it a go. So have you ever felt your spirits lifted by seeing a bird in your garden, a robin maybe joining you while you dig in or something, or birds at the bird table? Can you raise your hand very visibly if any of that applies to you? Thank you very much. I'll just look at the second screen, see how many. Yeah, that's not bad. Okay, so keep it up, and you know, even if that's not the case, has this ever happened? Have you ever looked at one of your famous Lincolnshire skies, you know, totally blue, or amazing cloud formation, or amazing sunsets? Oh, how incredible is that? Has that ever applied to you? So keep your hands up. Oh, I don't think I need to go on, really. I mean, I'm going to ask one more, but, you know, have you ever felt you needed just to get out of the house or out of your office and walk around the streets or the field just to clear your head? Yes. So, well, as far as I can tell, I had a few more questions, but I don't think there's any need to go on. I mean, it's just about all of you, and that was only 3 questions. Well, thank you very, very much. You can put your hands down now. I've got news. You're all entirely normal. I'm really sorry, Pete, but you're all entirely normal. In that respect, I can't vouch for others, and there's a lot of respects in which I'd say my brother is not normal, but in that respect, you're all normal. And that shouldn't be a surprise, because we are wired, neurologically wired, to respond to nature. And that shouldn't be a surprise either, because we have a creator God who's created, however he did it, us and the rest of nature. And we now know, and the Bible tells us, both scientists are just finding out, that we're really, really interlinked. And for example, there's a bit of the brain they've now discovered that actually is refreshed when we get access to nature, when we take a walk in the park or look at the sky, like a tired muscle being rested. It helps us make better decisions. It keeps our emotions calmer. It helps us have more perspective on things. They've now found the bit of the brain that does it. But it shouldn't be a surprise to us if God created it all to be in relationship with each other and in many respects to serve each other under him. And that's really what I want to talk about today, restoring our relationship with nature, with the rest of creation under the authority of God, and what that leads us to do then as Christians. Now, I know you've had from Adam, I think, very recently, some of the theology about this. So I'll just recap a little bit on that. I am, as you will have heard, I'm not a renowned theologian. I'm much more of a troublemaker. But I am a lifelong Christian, and I take this very seriously. So if you know, I would go to absolute books and libraries that have been written about this if you want more. But I'll just give you the very basics of the theology. Then I'll want to move on to more about the church itself and why and how the church can act on these issues. And in the middle, I'll say a little bit more about the issues themselves, just give you a few facts and figures to work with. And I think if we've got time, we can chat afterwards as well. So very briefly, a concise view of why should Christians care about creation, the environment? What does the Bible have to say on this? Well, I've got 6 points, and they're quite brief. The first is God made it. In Genesis chapter 1, God creates the heavens and the earth, the land, the sky, the seas, plants, and finally humankind. And however we believe it came about, God made it. That's very clear right there at the start of the Bible. The second thing is that God loves it. In Genesis chapter 1, it says that God looked at what he had made and declared it was very good, not just average or not irrelevant or, well, that was interesting, now I'll go and do something else, but very, very good. He loved what he had made. The third point is he then wants us to love it too. In Genesis chapter 2, verse 15, we read, the Lord took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and take care of it. Work and take care. And that can be translated as to till and to keep, or to serve and preserve. That's how it's translated. So Christian dominion over nature that we often have heard about is not to be domination. It's completely different. It's to be an exercise in serving creation on God's behalf as servant leaders. Fourthly, then, as we know, human sin created a breach with God, our fellow humans, and with the rest of nature. And one of the results of that has been our terrible stewardship of nature. You only have to watch TV or open the paper any day or go online, and there's news of environmental disaster. And right now in Britain, we're suffering yet another bout of severe flooding, in part from changes in weather patterns because of climate change. But we also see a rapid loss in wildlife in this country. I'm sure many of you, anybody who's like 50 or older, will have already noticed this. I mean, tell me if you've noticed with your own eyes the change in wildlife around you in Lincolnshire. I certainly have. I mean, where Pete and I and our brother and sister lived when we first came back from Australia, we lived in a little village in Worcestershire. I used to go out bird watching, and I would see vast flocks of linnets and yellowhammers and greenfinches and so on. If you go now, they're just, if you're lucky, if you see a few of those. Here's my bird diary, my little geeky bird diary which I kept when I was 15. It's got all sorts of, I mean, in addition to my terrible handwriting and terrible spelling, which remains awful, it's got all sorts of records of the stuff I saw. Yeah, there you go, a little picture of a linnet I drew. Very excited when I was a little 15-year-old. I was seeing vast flocks of these things. They're just not there anymore. And so we've seen it with our own eyes. We've been terrible stewards. And at the bottom of that is sin, a broken relationship between us and the rest of God's creation. But there is good news. Here's my fifth point on this canter through the theology. And the good news is that good news of Jesus. The New Testament has the answer to this sin in redemption and reconciliation through Jesus. And really interestingly, and Christians are only just beginning to rediscover this, when you reread the scripture that we've been fed and read so many times with a different eyes and your mind open, you read some incredible things. So in John chapter 3:16, he writes, for God so loved the world, that he gave his one and only son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish. You know the rest, But the word used in the original Greek for world is cosmos, i.e. the universe. So Jesus is good news for the universe, for everything, not just humans. And it's not just the visionary John, who, some thought was a bit spaced out, that said these things. The very down-to-earth Apostle Paul writes the same thing in different words. So in Colossians chapter 1, verse 20, he says, Jesus reconciles all things to himself on the cross. And consistent with that, Mark, the very basic, not particularly educated Mark, writes in his Gospels, and we are told to go and preach the good news to all creation. That's what it actually says. Now, for hundreds of years, we've read that over and over and over and thought it just applied to people, but it's not actually what it says. And we're just beginning to realize, and scientists are also telling us, this stuff is also connected. If we don't look after it all, every bit suffers. If we don't look after all of creation, we suffer as part of it. So if that's not enough reason to care for creation, because God loves it, made it, wants us to serve it as well as use it, there's a sixth reason. And this is critical and comes into play more and more now. Jesus asked us, or when asked rather, what was the greatest commandment, said, as we all know, love God and love your neighbor. And Jesus is talking here about how we treat the vulnerable, the marginalized, the poor, the migrants, refugees. We know that. But we now know that these are the very people suffering worst from the impacts of climate change, from biodiversity loss, and from other environmental damage, including air pollution here in this country. Did you know that air pollution in this country is thought to kill prematurely about 40,000 people a year in this country alone? In rural and urban districts, there's a lot of pollution from agricultural chemicals in the countryside, and a lot of pollution often from fossil fuels, from diesel and so on in the cities. That combination can be absolutely lethal for people with asthma and other pulmonary and respiratory diseases. So in short, if my actions are contributing, however unwittingly, to the ill health or the poverty of my neighbor, actually I'm not loving them. It may be accidental, but I'm not loving them the way I could. And what we're now seeing is the way we're damaging the environment is massively damaging our global and local nature very often. So those are 6 biblical reasons why we really do need to take this very seriously. So we have a double mandate then, not just because God created it, but because of loving our neighbor. We have a double mandate to care for creation. So let me move on to what we can do about this. But first, let me just give a quick recap on some of the straight facts at the moment about the environment. Some of this is a bit depressing, but there is good news at the end. We know, according to the science, that and the Paris Agreement from of the United Nations, agreed 6 years ago now, said that we've only got very few years really to avoid catastrophic climate change. And that's why the Paris Agreement committed the world to try to keep the global average temperature rise, I can explain the science later if you want, to under 2 degrees above what it was in the pre-industrial era, before we put loads and loads of smoke and carbon dioxide and burnt loads of coal in the Industrial Revolution, before we put all of that into the air, which we've obviously carried on doing, to try to keep temperature rise to no more than 2 degrees above how it was then. Now, that's great that the world has decided these things. The bad news is we are way off track from doing that. We're currently heading to 3 to 4 degrees, which is catastrophe. That's the end of life as we know it. To give you an idea, that means massively falling food production, sea level rises in our lifetime for many of us. And the sea is already rising, but that will mean swamping of coasts around many parts of the world, certainly by the middle of this century. Mega wildfires of the sort we've seen in Australia and California in the last few years becoming really quite normal. Killer heat waves like we had in 2003 and again in 2019 becoming actually quite normal in Northern Europe, not just the Sahara Desert. That's what we're talking about. That makes much of the world frankly uninhabitable. With all that that implies, we really are talking about the end of life as we know it, unless we can head off this scenario. And I remember 20 years ago when I first started working on this, people thought this was way out there sometime. We didn't need to worry about it. Science would come up with a solution. It's a problem for another generation. Well, we're already seeing it happen much, much faster than the scientists then were even predicting. So that's the bad news. But some good news, first of all. We do know what we need to do, and I can say more about this, but it's very clear. Thousands of eminent reports have been written by some of the best scientists and economists and sociologists around. We know what needs to be done, and we can do it. Technically, theoretically, we can do it. What's often lacking is the political will, the governments having the courage to actually lead, and there's a reason for that too. But the second piece of good news is that we have an imminent opportunity to do something about that, because next year, or this year now, end of this year, is a major international summit, Paris +5, they're calling it, although it's in fact 6 years after Paris because it was delayed because of COVID, when the world will look again at the targets that were set and how we're doing as a body of nations, and should be ramping up those targets, ramping up its ambition to work faster on this. Now we have a very particular, and here's a third bit of good news, handle on that in the UK, because I'm sure, as many of you know, this conference is actually happening in the UK. For the first time ever, the British government is actually co-hosting with Italy, just to confuse things. That's a whole other story. Technically, we're co-hosting it with Italy, but it's happening in Glasgow. Figure that one out. This World Summit. And we have a huge opportunity then as Christians and citizens in the UK to influence that outcome and to influence our government around this agenda through prayer and through action and through speaking out. And fourthly, I think, and I want to come right back here to the relationship with people and creation, there's some immense good news, I think, in that just about everything we need to do to get out of this climate change problem is also really, really helpful for several other reasons, what they call co-benefits. So to give you an example, we need to get off fossil fuel very fast, oil, coal, gas, in this country and elsewhere. And Britain's not doing so badly on that actually, but we need to get off very fast. But the faster we get off fossil fuel, the better it will be for air quality and water quality, and that helps people's health. We need to make a massive reduction in our consumption of natural resources. Stop the throwaway culture, adopt what's being called a circular economy. So everything is used and recycled and nothing is wasted. But doing that would be a massive boon for nature as well. We would get rid of all the plastic in the rivers, in the seas, on the mountaintops, for example, that is doing so much damage as well as being unsightly. We need to change our food production. I'm not somebody who thinks we should all go vegan. I don't think that's necessary. What we should be doing, and the science says this very clearly, is radically reducing our meat consumption, our dairy consumption. But actually, as I think probably most doctors will tell you, that would be brilliant for human health as well. In this country, we eat way too much of the wrong stuff, leading to absolute epidemics of preventable diseases because our diet is often so rubbish. So you get an idea. And then lastly, we need to restore and rewild large areas of habitats, forests, wetlands, etc., to absorb carbon and to help control flood. Well, wouldn't that be nice for nature too? To have its forests back, to have its wetlands back, to have its etc., etc. Would that be nice for people to see that flourishing with wildlife again? So there's virtually nothing we need to do for climate change that isn't also very good for something else. And I think there's something beautiful about that. And that's really good news, because it means there's a chance to engage all sorts of people who may not really care about the science of climate change. In some cases, they still may not even believe it, but it will still give them something that is valuable to them. And I think that's really good news. So for time, I'm going to press on and just talk a little bit about nature, and then what can churches do? I could tell a similar story about nature. I've just talked about climate change there, but as you probably know, nature is in a similarly bad state. A big research report by London Zoo and WWF, they update it every couple of years, called the Living Planet report, has now shown that we have lost more or less 2/3 of the quantity, the volume, the numbers of wildlife in the world in just 50 years. Since I was a lad, hanging around with my binoculars in muddy fields in Worcestershire, the world has lost 2/3 of the numbers. That's not 2/3 of the species. It's the volume, it's the numbers in each species. Now, a lot of species have gone west as well. Thankfully, not that number, but the sheer volume has disappeared. That's why when we go bird watching in the countryside, we don't see what we used to see before. You might see a couple of greenfinches, but you don't see a whole flock, and so on. Their numbers have really dwindled. Yet, and we know that we need these things. We need microbes in the soil. We need bees and other insects to pollinate our food. Even the whales in the sea, they now know, have a function. They now know that by diving really deep to where the water is cold and coming back up, as they do, are actually mixing the cold water with the hot and helping keep the sea cooler. So even whales have a function in regulating our climate. Nature and climate itself is very, very connected. So working at it the other way around, the things we can do for nature are probably really good for climate change too. Okay, so that just gives you an idea of the solutions that are out there and why we need to act on this. And if you want to get excited about rewilding, there's so much going on already that people have not really clocked. So again, if you're interested in birds, you'll probably know that 20, 30 years ago, red kites were virtually extinct in this country. They've been shot and poisoned to death. Now, as I'm sure you know, they're kind of everywhere, but they were reintroduced deliberately. And over the last 30 years, we've rebuilt the population of otters. Beavers are now flourishing in many parts of the country. And believe it or not, in 2 years' time, they're reintroducing the wild European bison to Britain. It last trod these islands 6,000 years ago, before it was eaten to death, frankly. They are reintroducing bison into a wood in Kent next year. We know what to do. What we need to do, however, is to do it on a much faster and bigger scale. And that's where I believe Christians in the church comes in. Now, I'll speed up here and just give you a quick view of when we can do as Christians in churches. But before I do, I just want to point your attention towards the assets, the things that God has given us with which we can do this. Just think about it. We've got a double mandate. So we've got legitimacy. We can act on this. Our Bible, our faith tells us it's our business to act on this. The second thing, there is a church of some form or another, by which I mean a worshiping community. I don't mean a building. In every single village, town, neighborhood in this country, there are 50,000 self-defined church communities, worshiping communities in this country. Many have buildings, of course, some don't, like you. So we've got a huge presence around the country to demonstrate, to witness to what is right. We've got national and international links as networks. Some churches do have lots of land, which they could dedicate to the use for nature. Churchyards, investments, which they could make sure go towards funding a clean economy, not the old fossil fuel stuff. We've even, many of us, thankfully, got gardens that we can use for nature and also even for climate change. I can explain that more. So just think of all of those things we can bring to the table. So there's also, I believe, and we should do this because it's the right thing to do, but I believe there's a huge benefit to the church itself by re-engaging in that relationship with all of creation under our Creator job. So churches joining together perhaps with others in the community to restore a piece of land locally for the benefit of biodiversity. If it's open to the public, that will also provide peace and mental well-being for those who need it. And we know, as I've said, we all benefit from that relationship with nature. Or joining with others as a local church to call publicly for faster action on climate change in your locality or nationally is a prophetic witness to wider society, helping tackle injustice and growing climate anxiety, particularly among the young. And it will rightly mean that we are much more relevant to the concerns and the worries of this generation coming up. And including thanks and praise to God for his nature in our worship services and so on, will point people back to God in a way that many other things won't. I mean, I've worked for many years, as you know, Friends of the Earth and in other secular environmental organizations. It may not be full of Christians. They may not, most of them recognize or say that they have a faith. But most people will look at nature and go, that is incredible. How did that happen? It makes people wonder. And if we as Christians aren't saying, yes, there's a reason it's so wonderful, it's because we've got a creator God. Come and get to know him with me. I mean, that's a fantastic opportunity. That's not the reason we should do it. We should look after nature because God tells us to. But it cannot possibly be bad for the church and the development of our worshiping bodies and our engagement with the local community that we wish to bless, the places we wish to bless. It can only be good for that. So, to close, what can you do? I would recommend 3 things, and I'll just go through them. Think about what you do as a church. Think about what you do as individuals and homes and families. And think about what you do this year. Those overlap. So as a church, you are already, as Threshold, you've joined a scheme called Eco Church, which happens to be run by Rocha. And it's really important, I think, that you join with an organization or a group of people to go together. These things are so much easier to do when you're working with others. So Eco Church allows you to go through a program of activities, which you're starting to go through, and to slowly improve what you are doing as a church in terms of, you know, what you teach about this, how you use your money, if you have land, how you use your land, and so on. So that, well done to you. That's the first thing. Keep going on Eco Church, and we really look forward to working with you more, to connecting you up with other churches to learn lessons from them and share what you know. That's the first thing. Get going as a church. The second thing is look at what you can do as individuals and homes with what you've got, with your garden, with your own purchasing and so on. Without going through a long list of things, one way of doing that is just link up to a local wildlife organization or whatever. I'm a proud member of Surrey Wildlife Trust. I'm sure you've got a very good Lincolnshire Wildlife Trust up there. But if you want a particularly Christian take on some of these issues, please do sign up to our Wild Christian scheme at Rocha. It's on the website, it's free. That will give you a monthly e-news of ideas, but also biblical reflection. It really is linking practical action with what does our Bible have to say about this. Okay, so please do go into that. And I've given the details of this to Sarah, I think, up there, and I think they'll be circulated later for those who want a quick link into this. Then the last thing is this year. What can we do this year? It's really, really important that Christians club together this year to demand of our government, in the nicest possible way, but confidently, that they also, whether they believe in God or not, need to do the right thing by the environment, by creation. And we're particularly, as a Rocha, working with a raft of other Christian organizations to launch something called Climate Sunday. You're part of it right now, even if you didn't know it. The website is now up there, and we're calling on churches to do 3 things which we believe will make a really big difference this year when we have the climate negotiations in this country. The first is to hold a climate-focused service. This will do for you. To really understand the theology and the action you can take. This is good enough. You can register today as your Climate Sunday service. The second thing is to commit to taking further action as a church long beyond the rest of this year. Keep going as far as you can go on this agenda. There is no time to lose. Now, if you will commit to that, we can also tell the government, look how many churches are prepared to take action. We're putting our money where our mouth is. Now, why don't you do the same? So please do go on the website. And the sort of thing you can commit to is, let's say under Eco Church, getting to the bronze level by the end of the year, or if you're already there, get to silver by the end of the year. See what I mean? There's a whole raft of things you can commit to. You decide what is right for you as a church, but write it down on the website so we can collect your commitments. And then the last thing is to sign a common call, which we're asking all churches to do, a call to our government to put our house in order as Britain on climate change before we lead the international community. That's not only right because of credibility, right because of honesty and integrity, but it will also give us so much more influence come November in Glasgow when we try to tell other countries what they should do. They're not idiots. They look at our record. They can see that the British government has just agreed to open a whole new coal mine. they can see that the British government has just given permission for what will be the biggest new gas-fired power station in Europe. And they are going to say, well, hang on a minute. What are you doing? Why should we do all sorts of stuff you're demanding when you're doing this? There is a desperate need for integrity in our government to be consistent in its messaging and its actions on climate change. And now is the time. We have a window of opportunity to get all the churches to commit to doing it themselves. This is really important. And then ask the government to do the same. So we would absolutely love it if after this, somebody with the appropriate authority within the threshold goes on that website and just makes that commitment that you agree is right for you. It doesn't have to happen today. You might want to talk it through for a few weeks and go, what should you be committing to? But sign that comment as well. That's enough, I think. But I just really want to encourage you to think and pray about this more and start off with enjoyment. So often, environmentalists have depressed the hell out of everybody, to be honest, by telling them how bad everything is. Now, things aren't in a great shape, but I honestly believe we have to start with ourselves and with others, with enjoying the gift of nature that God has given us, loving it, learning to appreciate it, thanking God for it, which is by far the best motivation for us and everybody else for looking after it. People ultimately bury their heads in the sand with fear, anxiety. They go into denial when it all seems too difficult to solve. But if we start off by thanking God for his nature and keeping on thanking him for his gift of nature and a stable climate and soil that works and air that we can breathe and all of those things that we rely on, that ultimately is the best motivation for actually keeping on looking after it and looking after it better. And I think that will really work also with the local community. Most people don't want to be depressed by how bad things are. They want some fun. I think nature is hugely fun, hugely beautiful. Now and again, it bites you too, let's be real. But generally speaking, it's great to be out in nature. Let's thank God for that. Let's use it and let's discover how to rebuild our relationship with nature under our Creator God. Thank you.
Fantastic. Well done, Andy. Thank you so much. That's really, really good.
Thank you.
We're going to have communion in a minute, but I just wanted to give space for one or two people